combine solution-focused therapy and animal-assisted therapy. I know that you have your dogs with you sometimes in the therapy room, I think. So
I do. They're here now, actually, as we're doing this interview. You know, that was another thing that happened completely by accident. Most of the successful things in my life I've stumbled onto, but I've always, always, always loved dogs. I've had a dog since I was 2 years old. And when I was a little girl, I wanted to raise seeing eye dogs. You know, I thought that would be very fun because I liked the idea of being able to take a dog into a supermarket or go shopping or take him to work. But I was horrible at training dogs. So my mother quickly pointed out I could never train a dog for someone who needed their services. But I got this little collie puppy. You know, I always wanted a collie. I think I was watching way too much Lassie movies. And when I got married, I decided I wanted this collie puppy. And my husband said, you know, we can get one because they're going to be big dogs. But we had to wait until we had a house with a yard. So when we did finally get a house with a yard, we picked out this little collie puppy. We named him Rockefeller. He was the most adorable little puppy, and we were taking him to the pet store to pick out his food and a collar and a bowl and all the things you get for dogs. And I look over and my brand new little collie puppy is sitting just like a foot away from a little toddler and is looking up at this child, just hoping the child is going to notice him and pet him. And all the other dogs in that store were jumping up on people, knocking things over, you know, urinating on things. They were just sort of a mess. And yet my puppy was so well behaved. And it was, again, just dumb luck. I hadn't trained him at all. And my husband looked over at that and he simply said, wow, we should really take him into Children's Hospital and have him visit with the children. It would make them very happy. So I loved the idea. So when I came home, I started making some telephone calls trying to find out how do I take this puppy into the hospitals and visit. And I soon learned you can't take a puppy into hospitals and visit with people because of their behavior. And the dog has to be at least a year old and has to be well trained. So I decided at that time that I wanted to start training this new puppy to be a therapy dog so he could go into hospitals and things like that. And here in the United States, we have big warehouse stores where they sell lumber and they do allow you to bring your family pets in as you shop. It's just like garden supplies and dirt and all kinds of stuff you buy there. So I would take my dog, Rockefeller, Rocky for short, and I would take him into this store to practice his obedience. And there was one time where my husband was taking forever looking at power tools, and I had my dog in a sit-stay practicing his manners. And there's this mom that looked completely frazzled, and she had all of these children, and the children were knocking things over and running all over the place and screaming, and this mom was so frazzled, and she came up to me and she made a comment about how well behaved my dog was. And I smiled and I said, well, you know, it just takes a lot of persistence, and you know, he can run around and be pretty crazy too, but he's practicing his manners. And after this whole conversation, I got to thinking about in the work setting, the drug and alcohol treatment setting where I worked, it was part of public health. And there were oftentimes these moms that would bring their children in for immunizations or medical services. And these children would be running all over the place and out of control. And I got to thinking, what a blessing it would be if any of those parents would come up to me as a social worker and express interest. And how do you get a creature to be so well behaved? Because so much of what I was telling this mom was the same tools you use to teach children how to listen, how to mind, how to resist their impulses, you know, because that's what Rocky was doing. He wanted to run around and play as well, but he had to learn to obey and to trust me. And so I got to thinking about, well, forget taking Rocky into Children's Hospital. I want to take him to work with me. I want him to sort of become this magnet to parents that would get them curious and bring them over and say, how did you get your dog to be so well behaved? And so I broached the subject with my boss, thinking she will never go along with this. And she said, I think this might work. You'll have to talk to the medical director. And I didn't want to talk to the medical director. He was a person that is very much just into medicine, not psychotherapy. I didn't know him very well, but my boss kept saying, you might be surprised how supportive he is. And it turns out in his internship as a medical doctor, he worked at Johns Hopkins Hospital where they had therapy dogs. And so he loved the idea of therapy dogs in a medical setting. And my boss knew that. And so when I presented the idea to him, he thought it was a fabulous idea. And so I got permission to bring a therapy dog into public health. And I started working with our clients, and it really was miraculous. Our clients, by definition, were angry, grumpy, mean in many ways. They didn't want to be there. Their children had just been taken away from them because of their drug use, and they blamed us. They saw us as part of the system. And yet, when you work with a therapy dog, the research talks about the animals being a social lubricant. When you take a dog for a walk in public, strangers will come up to you and just engage in a conversation about your dog. It's a very odd phenomenon that as a woman, if I was just going for a walk in a park and somebody came up to me and just started talking with me, I would be frightened and I would be suspicious. But when that happens when you're walking a dog, it just seems like the most natural thing in the world. People just come up to you. And that is what was happening in the treatment center, is that these angry clients would forget for a moment how angry they were, and they would come up and ask about the dog. For example, there was one situation where I was in my office with Rocky, and I had a baby gate, so he could be loose and off leash in my office, and he could look over the baby gate and into the waiting room, and he was very cute when he did that. And there was this client out there one day, and the client was so angry. He was yelling at my front desk staff about how unfair it was that he had to pay, and he was just so angry. And then all of a sudden he turns and he looks at Rockefeller over the baby gate and he says, what the hell is a dog doing in the health department? And I quickly put on Rocky's leash and I took him into the waiting room and I introduced myself and I said, and this is Rocky. He's an employee here. His job is to make people smile. Do you like dogs? And this angry person all of a sudden gets this big smile on his face. And he sits down on the floor, of all places. And Rocky, who at that point was 80 pounds, just started licking his earlobes. And this man, who seconds before was just yelling, was laughing and giggling like a little girl on the floor and enjoying this collie. And it was at that moment that the therapist, who was going to do the drug and alcohol evaluation with him, came into the waiting room, and I looked over and she was just leaning against the wall with a big smile on her face as she's watching this interaction between this client and this collie, because it was just a beautiful interaction. And after a few minutes, she introduced herself and she says, are you ready to go back and we'll get this appointment over? And the client said, sure, I'd be happy to, and gave Rocky a quick kiss and said, you'll be here when I get back, right? And I said, oh yes, he will. And they went back and did their evaluation. The research shows in animal-assisted therapy that when professionals see a client interacting with a dog, they will view the client as being more treatable. And when a client views a professional as interacting with an animal or a therapy dog, they will view the professional as being more approachable. So that dynamic was central to why this worked so well in our treatment program. So when this therapist, her very first image of her new client was of him sitting on the floor, giggling, playing with the dog. She let her guard down. She was more herself. She looked forward to meeting this client. If she had come out when this same client was angry and raising his voice and yelling at the receptionist, she would have had a very different view of this client. And I love that about therapy dogs, that they bring out the true human being. They help everybody feel more comfortable. People are more authentic when they are around animals, assuming they like animals. You know, we talk in a different voice. You know, I use a baby voice sometimes when I talk with my animals, and I'm much more willing to look stupid or to take a risk when I'm with an animal. Our clients are the same way. And we saw that happen time and time again, that it just changed the environment. You know, there's also just parenting kind of stuff. You know, there was another time when one of the moms, because a lot of the moms would come to the other programs, because we were part of a big public health system. It wasn't just drug and alcohol treatment. But this one mom came in and she had these 3 boys. And these 3 boys, you could always tell when they arrived because it was just mass chaos. And the staff were so frustrated because these children were running and screaming up and down the halls. And one of them noticed the sign in her waiting room saying we had a dog, and he said, "I want to meet the dog." And so I shut the door to my office to give Rocky some privacy, and I came out and I said, "Well, you'd have to get your mom's permission." You know, and so he said, "I'll get my mom's permission." So he runs out and finds his mom and drags his mom over and says, "Okay, now can I see the dog?" And I said, "Well, let's talk to mom first." And I said to mom, "Is it okay if your sons," because he brought his 2 brothers over as well, "if they meet the dog?" And she's like, "Yes, that would be fine." And I said, "Okay, but you have to be sitting down quietly in chairs in order to see the dogs." And all of a sudden, these 3 kids that had been so out of control were sitting down so quietly in these chairs, smiling, waiting with anticipation for this big dog to come out. And I said, "You know, you got to stay in the chairs or Rocky's going to have to go back in his room." And for a good 20 minutes, these were the most polite children you have ever seen in your life. They listened to their mom, everything. And while the dog was out there, I could simply ask the mom questions about, "Wow, how did you teach your boys to mind so well? And did you know that they could be so quiet and polite?" And she's like, "No, I've never seen this before in my life." And I said, "Well, you must have taught them because they do it so well." And all I was doing was asking exception questions and becoming curious. And it was a natural thing that exceptions would happen when the dogs were around. Depressed people would suddenly smile. And I could get curious about what other things made them smile. You know, our children were well behaved. And so, yeah, that's how I use the dogs. I always say the dog is just a dog. You know, he didn't get a degree or anything. He's just a well-trained dog. I'm the one who's just using solution-focused therapy. I'm using the exceptions that are in the room. Or I'll ask relationship questions, and I might say, "Imagine it's next session. And, you know, Rocky's really good at picking up subtlety. I'm not that great. So what would Rocky notice when you first walk in that makes him think, oh, something's different about this client? What would he pick up on?" And people would look at more subtle things like, well, maybe I'd be standing taller. Or, you know, maybe I would be more relaxed. And I'd be like, well, how would Rocky know you were more relaxed? Well, because I'd probably give him eye contact and call him over. And then I could say, well, would that be different? Oh, yeah. Would that be a good difference? It'd be wonderful. So just those little things. I'm still doing exactly what I do.
Yeah.
But I always say, with a dog as my partner, together we are stronger.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the dog helps the clients feel more comfortable in a way that a human never could.
Mm-hmm.
And I can open doors for a dog that the dog never could,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and introduce him to situations and people that he wouldn't be able to do otherwise. So together, we're a strong team.
Yeah.